Vamos a dar paso a la conferencia magistral del doctor Schreyer de la OCDE, Midiendo el PIB en una economía digitalizada, principales avances. Voy a dar una breve síntesis de su currículum. Es subjefe estadístico de la OCDE. Sus áreas de investigación incluyen cuentas nacionales, la medición del capital, productividad, bienestar social, las actividades no de mercado y estadísticas de precios. Es autor de varios manuales de la OCDE y tiene un historial de publicaciones en revistas internacionales y libros muy grande. En 2008-2009 fue ponente en la Comisión Stiglitz-Senfotowski sobre la medición de desempeño económico y el progreso social. Sin más, le doy la palabra. Gracias.
Well, good morning, and many thanks for having me here. I should say I arrived with about 30 hours of delay from Paris, but the good news is this was not due to the digital economy, but rather to an old tech thing with somebody on the plane having a medical problem and the plane had to be diverted to Ireland and so on and so forth. So I come here full of optimism about the digital economy because this is what I'm going to talk to you about, measuring GDP in the digital economy. And I'll start with a graph that is representative of the debate that has been developing around this issue of the digital economy. These are labor productivity growth rates in G7 countries. And this very simple sort of GDP per hour worked on an annual basis over time. And I don't have to sort of go into the graphs itself. They convey the visual impression of a slowdown in productivity growth, and that is something that policymakers, analysts have been worried about over the past years and decades. And a number of explanations have been put forward to understand what is happening, and some of you will be aware of the debate that has been ongoing about the slowing rate of innovation, for example, that Bob Gordon had put forward. At the OECD, we are more inclined to think that innovation itself may not have slowed down, but there is an issue with the diffusion of innovation throughout our economies. Others have looked at business cycle effects. But there's also a school of thought that says innovation is happening. It's happening throughout the economy, but we're not picking it up in our measures, in our macroeconomic measures in particular, of output, GDP, and productivity. And this is what I call the mismeasurement hypothesis, and this is essentially what I'm going to talk to you about. There's been a lot of press coverage of the mismeasurement hypothesis over the past couple of years. And I always show this quote here because I think it is rather significant in terms of representing the debate out there. This is a press clip from an interview with Henri de Castries, who actually was already in 2015, was the chief executive of AXA, a big insurance company. So not someone who is uninformed about economics or about the business world. And he says that he doesn't believe for a second the idea that productivity does not grow anymore. It's just badly measured. We are witnessing a tremendous increase in the quality of services at decreasing cost. A Google search that costs nothing would have been invoiced very highly 25 years ago. If that is not productivity, what is it? And I think this is sort of epitomizes the debate that we are looking at, and this is what we're trying to sort of dissect a little bit from the statistical perspective here. There's been some systematic work ongoing along those lines, and There are some quotes here, some has taken place in our international institutions, some more in the academic sphere. Several of you will have heard about the UK review of statistics, the so-called Bean review, that was also strongly focused on this issue of how we're dealing with the digital economy in our measurement. And it's clear that the debate is not quite settled. I also have another quote here that relates to a rather recent paper in the Journal of Economic Perspective, so a very prestigious outlet, where Marty Feldstein basically says he believes that there's a lot of growth and real consumption that we're missing from our data. We do feel that in order to look at this problem, one has to make a number of distinctions. Sometimes, or regularly, there is a bit of a confusion between what is an empirical issue, what is a conceptual issue. And I think that is important to distinguish if you want to ask the question whether our measures of national accounts and GDP and productivity are conceptually obsolete, or whether the concepts are fine, but we may have an issue with implementing them, or whether both the concepts and the implementation on the whole is okay, and the things that we're looking are actually outside the production sphere, which is the second point that needs to be distinguished, namely measures of production and productivity and measures of welfare, in particular, as we want to talk about more comprehensive welfare measures. Not everything that enhances welfare is necessarily something that should raise our productivity growth. Finally, the third issue that gets mixed up regularly in the debate is the question of volume and prices, or GDP, or macroeconomic measures in current prices on the one side, and the question about how do we deflate them, how do we construct price indices on the other side. So those are the things that I think need to be kept apart. In what I will be talking to you about, I will predominantly look at current price measures. Also, I will have to say something about price indices and deflation as well. There's work ongoing at the OECD, actually jointly with the IMF, some of it because there's a lot of interest in, as I said, in the policy sphere. The G20 actually was looking at this, has been looking at this quite intensely as well. So there's a lot of interest and activity in all this. Now here's our take on the mismeasurement hypothesis in 5 domains where we think that the digital economy is particularly present and where we need to think particularly hard about these measurement issues. The first one is what we may call new forms of intermediation services. What do I mean here? I mean the emergence of digital platforms that provide intermediation services of supply and demand that is out there. The services themselves are not new, so a taxi or taxi driving is not new, but the intermediation is new and digitally enabled now. So the taxi reservation service, where you had to call up in the past to get someone to pick you up, you now do it via the internet. And it has sort of generated new supply as well by enabling Uber and other companies to happen. Or travel agents, I mean the whole intermediation system there between a hotel and someone who wants to stay in a hotel has completely changed. The first sort of thing to remind for those who are probably a little less familiar with the national accounts is that when we look at the value added that is generated by these platforms, we shouldn't forget that the value added of the platforms is only the commissions and the fees that these platforms generate. It's not the whole turnover of Airbnb that is the value added of Airbnb, of the platform. No, the value added is only the wages and profits that Airbnb generates by charging commissions. We'll look at what happens to the other thing in a second. And in principle, these commissions, they are captured in GDP. I mean, Airbnb is surveyed by business surveys, so you have a standard process to get these values in. There is a little bit of an issue when the platforms are abroad, because then the measurement of imports and exports of services may become trickier than if the platform is domestic. But there's certainly not no sort of basic conceptual issue in getting hold of those data. Now let's have a bit of a closer look at some of these intermediation services and start with one that is well known to many of you, accommodation services that are intermediated, for example, by Airbnb. If you look at these dwelling services by households, of course, the long-run rentals, there's not much that has changed there. What is of interest are the short-term rentals that are intermediated through these platforms. Clearly, they have increased significantly over the past years, and we need to ask ourselves, do we capture the production activity of these suppliers of lodging services correctly? So we're not talking about the platforms anymore. We're now talking about the production that is put forward by the households who offer their rooms and apartments via one of these platforms. These households, you could qualify them as sort of occasional self-employed. You know, not everyone does this the whole year. You do it on and off. And there is a question of how well these activities are covered by our labor force surveys, for example. That labor force surveys would survey households and should, in principle, capture activities there, or tax returns should also capture taxable income that arise from these activities. But you know, there's some gray areas there for sure, both on the labor force survey and on the tax information. Some of this may go undeclared. The labor force survey may not be fully efficient, or it's directed at one person in the household who doesn't actually know what the other person in the household does that is being inquired. So there are a number of things that need investigating. But we should not forget that in the national accounts we actually have an imputation for what is called owner-occupied housing. So we already say that if you own an apartment that you live in, you're actually producing for yourself these housing services. And we already have an imputation there for consumption and production associated with these services. So if you then go and rent 2 rooms of your apartment to someone who comes to Paris, well, it means you have, you know, the statistician may want to label this differently, and there may be a differential there, but it's not as if these housing production services had never been there and suddenly appeared with these new platforms. So it would be a shifting around, but it's probably not something that would change your GDP in any significant way. Second example is business and transportation services. So our Uber example again, we have this question about the occasional self-employed and whether we survey them correctly through our labor force statistics. Of course, if transactions happen on a cash basis, this may not be captured. But then again, the whole business model and the technology that enables these things to happen does not involve cash. I mean, you cannot pay cash when you hire an Uber, so there is typically some sort of record of the production that goes on of these services. And the question for the statisticians is more, what is the right place to look for this information? Is it the tax return from the households, or maybe is it the information that the platforms themselves have that could actually be a very efficient way of getting hold of this production of services. A third example here is distribution services of, when you trade things, say via eBay, the longest standing example here, but of course there are many others. Again, the value additive is the distribution margin that is made by the distribution firm. But of course, if this happens between households or for second-hand goods, this is not something that we normally include in GDP. And if it happens to a bigger scale, again, this is not something that we would be able to capture. You all know when you go to eBay or Amazon, I mean, there are sales of new goods as well, but then typically those are through professional retailers that advertise or propose this as an outlet, and then sort of we are basically back to our basic measures of how do we capture the value added in these firms, either through surveys or by looking at the platforms themselves. When the informal economy is large, that can be a problem, of course, but in conjunction with the digital economy, the informality is not such a big issue. I mean, we've had this before and elsewhere, informality, but not necessarily a phenomenon that has grown with digitalization of the economy. Second domain, consumers as producers. So what we also observe with digitalization is that the production boundary, or the boundary between consumption and production, sort of has been moving and has become blurred in a number of ways. Examples, you're now able to book your own flight as a household, something that formerly was only possible by a travel agent. You check in yourself at the airport. You scan your products at the supermarket, which is basically you're providing labor for the retailer there. So you're producing a service. You do your online banking. So what all these things have in common is a sort of a movement from dedicated market producers a bit out of the market into households. And the question is, are we capturing this, and should we capture it? Other examples, again, where one could clearly argue that a household produces, digitally enabled, is when you generate free assets. For example, you write an entry for Wikipedia. Well, this is, you are producing an intangible asset there. There's absolutely no doubt, because you spent time and effort to produce something. Of course, this is nowhere readable in GDP. It is intangible asset. The question that you can see already coming here is, well, should this be something that we want in GDP? I think that's a little less clear. It is certainly an element of production there, but there's also a big element of leisure there. I mean, no one forces people to produce for Wikipedia. And of course, when you move into it's probably a mixture between production and leisure, and where the leisure activities, leisure should be reflected in GDP is a much less clear issue, and probably the answer is no. The other thing is one of consistency. There are actually many household activities out there where people produce, and this is not in GDP. Childcare, cooking, gardening, those are massive production activities by households. By convention, they are outside GDP. And so if we say that our Wikipedia entry should be part of GDP, then we should also think about childcare maybe coming into GDP. But there are good reasons why it's not there. And so there's a bit of a matter of consistency. And if it were there, what we know from estimates about household production of childcare, care of the elderly, and so on, these are big, big figures. So you would increase GDP by 20, 30, 40% if you brought that in. You wouldn't see anything of the Wikipedia entries anymore if all this came in. But there are good reasons, as I said, why it's not in there, and we can discuss, this if there's time. Let me move to the third domain, which is free products. This is sort of something that is frequently quoted as an example of the digital economy, providing free apps, free software that you're using, and this is something that doesn't show up in our macroeconomic figures. Okay, well, let's have a look here. You get a free app for your smartphone. You are being provided search capacity by your access to Google, for which you don't pay, at least not directly. You have a vast capacity to network socially through social media like Facebook and Twitter and others. And of course, these are free transactions, free in the sense that there is no direct monetary transaction that happens. But of course, somehow these services have to be financed. So the transactions happen indirectly, and typically in two ways. One is that by downloading a free app, you accept advertisements. So you're getting advertisements, which is a way how these software, the construction of this software is financed. Or you explicitly or not, or consciously or less consciously accept that the data that you generate by using the app is captured and sold off as an intangible asset or used in a different way. I mean, these are basically the business models, at least over the longer terms. Over the longer term, maybe some companies get sort of upfront financing through the stock market and so, but at one point, revenues will have to be generated one way or the other, and it somehow comes back to either advertisement or use of data. So what does this mean for the accounts? Well, the first thing to say is that in the case of advertisement, the value of the advertisement is actually reflected somewhere in the value of the final product for which the advertising is taken out. Okay, you accept this advertisement for a product that pops up on your application, but somewhere behind, because the advertising firm has to be paid, well, that is part of the cost for the producer of the final product. So it is just on a sort of superficial level, it is already somewhere in the level of GDP or in the level of final products that we measure. Still, one could say that there is an implicit transaction, and we could, in principle, say we want to make it explicit, so move it, impute, so to say, additional production that may be happening. Why would we want to do that? Well, we can say people are actually ready to pay for not receiving ads. Okay, so if you subscribe a premium service, that means this, in a way, is your willingness to pay for not receiving ads. So maybe this is the implicit price that you pay behind it. And of course, you can argue that if you have access to free apps, I mean, your real consumption somehow has gone up, even if we don't see any direct monetary transaction here. But there are counter arguments as well, because in the national accounts, if we impute additional value added or production, then somehow we have to have a picture how this production happens. And we have to impute some sort of production activity that the household undergoes by watching advertisement, which is a little hard to sell somehow, or we have to couch it in the form of a transfer from the corporate sector to the households. Anyway, we need rather strong assumptions on valuation. And of course, we need to think why this hasn't been done in the past, when we've all been watching television without paying explicitly, but of course we got all the advertisements up here. But at the end of the day, what we're interested, of course, is also how much does it matter? Can we try and quantify this to get a sense of the importance of such an imputation? Well, here's a little graph where we tried to simulate this imputation for a number of OECD countries. We just took the business statistics for these countries and said, we assume sort of a bit of an extreme case, say the whole value of advertising services is the value that could be imputed for these free products. We made a few adjustments, and then we just ran it through our accounts for the OECD countries to see how much did it influence the growth rate of GDP. And you see, we are in the bars here show the impact, and you see we are in the order of 0.2 percentage points per year on the negative side, because, for example, in Greece or in Denmark, the advertising industry actually contracted over the period that we looked at. So if this was the working hypothesis, we would have ended up with a lower real GDP growth than otherwise. For other countries, we get some of an addition, but it's certainly not enough to explain the productivity slowdown that I showed in my first slide. Don't forget also that in order to explain a productivity slowdown, you actually have to demonstrate that the measurement error gets worse. Okay, so it's sort of the second derivative that we're looking at, which we didn't do here. Another interesting study in this conjunction is by Leonard Nakamura and Rachel Soloveichik. She's from the BA. Leonard is from the Philadelphia Fed. They also looked at the value of free services. They used private source data to get a handle on this. They find indeed that these values have risen rapidly, but again, they find a rather small effect on GDP, both in level terms and in terms of the effects on the real growth rate of GDP. If we want to think about free products, we could also reason in terms of shadow prices that one could conceive, and there's some work by Irvin David and Kevin Fox on this that we may want to inject into our consumption price index. But those things get relatively tricky very quickly, because how do we select the shadow prices? And how good is a consumption price index that would be nourished by shadow prices that are basically come out of a modeling exercise? I mean, would that not undermine the credibility of the prices? And the effects on the price index are actually unclear. Domain number 4 is what we call a cross-border flow of intellectual property products. This is actually something that has been lively debated as well in the world of statisticians. Enabled again by the digital economy, intellectual property products and intellectual property assets have become increasingly important as sort of sources of competitiveness for firms and as sources of revenues for firms. They generate royalties from and licensing fees that are quite significant. As these things can be moved around with a mouse click, we find that they change countries very quickly. And there's a real issue here of how much of the revenues or income that is generated with these intellectual property products should we include in domestic measures of GDP? How much is actually just a transfer of income? So the statisticians have been struggling by making this distinction between what is really the production that is involved in creating these licenses and what is just shifting around of assets and income internationally. This is all around this notion of legal versus economic ownership. What brought this discussion into focus very quickly was the Irish GDP growth of about 26% last year, which is a number that, you know, I mean, I've been working at the OECD for nearly 30 years now, and I don't think I can remember any single country, any single year would have grown by 30%. So there's and the reason was that intellectual property assets have been moved into Ireland for a number of reasons. Tax reasons, one of them, but others as well, generating revenues there, being used there to produce licenses, and of course that gives a huge push to the Irish GDP. Because Ireland is a small country, you see these large relative changes. But it's not an Irish problem in the sense. It can happen everywhere, more or less visibly, and probably will happen even more in the future. So we're sort of struggling with how exactly to get a handle on this issue. Domain number 5 is prices and volumes. So even if we capture the activities in current prices rather correctly, the question is, well, at the end of the day, we're always interested in the real figures, so we need deflators and price indices to deal with that. And price measurement certainly is a challenge for these digital products for at least 3 reasons. One is with increasing digitalization, you have customization. So products, goods and services are made for customers, are unique. And if something is unique, you have a hard time comparing it with the same product a month later or a quarter later to measure your price change. There is a rapid generation of new varieties and new goods that come in, and the new goods problem is something that the price statistician have always recognized, but it's probably been amplified in the world in our digital world. And closely linked to this, the question of the quality change of existing products that we have with new features, new performance indicators. So this is something that is really a construction site, and actually Marshall will talk more about this tomorrow in his talk about price measures, and I'm sure we'll hear more in this meeting as well. What needs to be recognized in general is that not every welfare gain that may be associated with a new product or a new feature of a product is necessarily something that you want to recognize as a price decline or as an increase in volumes. There are some basic conceptual questions. I mean, one is listed here. If you are a subscriber to a streaming service or so, and as a consumer you download 10 movies instead of 5, but the subscription fee remains the same, does it mean that your price has halved or not? Certainly your real consumption has gone up by 100% because you watch twice as many movies. But do you think, or does it follow that your CPI should have been reduced in the same proportion? Or is the transaction actually the transaction about the subscription, and then you do download as much as you want? So those are sort of fundamental issues that play out in this context, and I think that do need further discussion. What we noticed when we looked at our national accounts at the OECD for information and communication technology, goods and services, was we saw rather large differences in the evolution of especially IT equipment between countries. So the left-hand graph here is the average annual growth of the deflator for ICT equipment in a selection of OECD countries over 5 years. And they fall even if you account for overall inflation. Okay, so the relative price change is like between -3% and +3% for a product that, you know, where the relative prices shouldn't diverge so much internationally because computers are internationally traded and so on. So there's a bit of a suspicion here that the statistical practice varies actually between countries rather than necessarily an economic reality that is so different. So that makes you think about the issue of price change, but again, we can run this through our little GDP measures and say, suppose we use the price change that we observed with the country, with Australia, so over -3 for ICT equipment, and we plug it into the national accounts of all the other countries. How much would it change the growth rate of real GDP of the other countries if they all had the same, you know, the same decline in prices? And, you know, it's again a rather sort of modest adjustment that comes out. The blue bar being the actually observed GDP growth, and the red one, the adjusted one. So the differential is between the red square and the blue bar, and then there's some variance to the theme here. And again, in some countries, you actually observe a decline in the adjusted measured GDP. Why is that? Well, because these countries import computers, okay? So if you say that your price index for computers was actually moving slower than initially thought, that means you had more real imports. That means you had lower growth rate of real GDP. So you know, things are not always translating in the way that one might think. What's my conclusion on all this? First of all, the good measurement is key in a digital economy, and we need to make a lot of efforts to advance on this. At the same time, we haven't found sort of the smoking gun yet that would explain the slowing of productivity growth that we've been observing in countries. We also feel that, at least from a conceptual point, GDP and our accounting framework is pretty much up to the task. One has to ask the right questions. What do we want in there as measures of production? What do we rather consider as measures of welfare that will be important to put a number on, but not necessarily in the context of GDP. Some construction sites are absolutely there. I was mentioning the occasional self-employed, so we have to take a hard look whether our labor force surveys, our tax returns are good enough to capture the activity of these households. I mentioned the international transactions into intellectual property products. Again, this is something that is a little hard to get at, and the issue of price indices as well. Certainly one natural way of progressing is to think about satellite accounts where our transactions as we observe them are broken down by its digital elements. Partly, I think, the discussion about the digital economy not being picked up in GDP is because we don't see it well enough, because we don't have the right classifications, breakdowns of the existing aggregates that would allow us to identify them in a meaningful way. So this is certainly something that needs doing. My second conclusion is that in some areas, maybe the problem is part of the solution. Two examples here. One is the digital intermediaries, the platforms I was talking about. By the very nature of this effect, you cannot have a large number of these platforms. Otherwise, you would lose the network effect. You cannot have 100 Ubers in an economy. It's probably limited, otherwise you lose this capacity of matching supply and demand. So actually the idea of getting information on the transactions that are moving through these platforms directly from the platforms is, I think, a promising practical avenue for statistical offices. And indeed, we do see in countries increasingly obligations being put on the platforms to either collect taxes or at least collect information for public purposes. The second example is the use of big data in constructing price indices and looking at quality change. Many of you will be familiar with the Billion Prices project at MIT, which is a great sort of tool to complement existing official statistics. And one feature of this tool is, of course, that you have a large number of high-frequency observations of products that are being transacted via the internet. And if you can match those high-frequency observations, then you can create matched models for price indices that have a certain possibility or many possibilities of dealing with quality adjustments. There's some work that ongoing by Alberto Carvalho, who is one of the initiators of this Billion Prices project. So there are new options also that arise in conjunction with the digital economy to deal with the statistical issues. Conclusion number 3 is what I said already repeatedly. GDP productivity is in the production sphere. The question of welfare is just as important, but is a different question, so probably requires a different answer. It may well be that there is a rising gap between GDP and welfare if all these new things have all these positive welfare effects. And we certainly want to complement GDP with well-being and welfare indicators. Notwithstanding which way you come out on this, more basic data, new classifications that allow us to identify digital products, digital transactions will absolutely be essential, and actually a lot of people are already working on this. And on that, I thank you for your attention.